Okay, so this is the lecture about chapter 21, which is about the late 18th century and the entire 19th century. Um, so, okay. Okay, so the 18th and 19th centuries, as you probably have figured out, we've skipped some centuries. The Renaissance was happening in the 1400s and 1500s, and we're skipping about 300 or 400 years and jumping forward to the 19th century because we just don't have time to cover absolutely every aspect of art history in this course. And the 19th century really is pivotal in terms of art history. The center of that was France. So most of the art that we're going to look at in the chapter 21 is French art because Paris was really the center of the art world at that time. But as the chapter title says, becoming modern, what does that mean? Okay, so the question is, what is modernity as a historical or social category? It's different from modernism in the arts, which we'll get to later. And that confused me for a long time. But right now, we're just focusing on modernity as sort of historical phenomenon. So, what modernity means is basically the end of feudalism, as it says here. So, we didn't really talk about the word feudalism when we were talking about feudalism art, but feudalism was the social hierarchy of the medieval period or the Middle Ages. Like when we were looking at all that medieval art on the cathedrals of Europe, the sculpture and all that, that was a feudal society that we were talking about. So a feudal society is one that's governed by a sort of hierarchy where at the top you have a king, and then underneath the king are some people like bishops and popes. Well, sometimes the kings and the popes were sort of equals fighting against each other. Maybe some bishops, some priests, some knights, some landed aristocracy. And then at the very bottom was a huge number of just sort of serfs, people who were attached to the land of the landed aristocracy, but who were basically had no real land of their own and very little power. Now, during the Middle Ages, the famous middle class started to grow. And by the 19th century, the middle class was, and the 18th century, the middle class was pretty much dominant, meaning shop owners, artisans, craftspeople that had their own businesses, and small farmers that owned their own land. So that's the middle class. So modernity, but it means other things sort of in addition to that. It means, as I wrote here, a questioning of tradition. That means, why should we believe all you priests? You priests have been telling us what the way things are for too long, and we're tired of that. So and we're tired of kings and nobility sort of ruling us, and all of that. We're just kind of questioning all of that. People were thinking more in terms of these concepts of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity. That means solidarity amongst non-aristocrats. Those were the slogans of the French Revolution, and to some extent the American Revolution. And then a faith in progress and rationality. What does that mean? Well, a revival, again, this happens periodically in history, in the Renaissance and so on, a revival of an interest in science and rationality as opposed to just blind faith. That is, being able to figure out how the universe works and put that scientific knowledge in the service of humanity. And we talked about the end of feudalism, which happened in the French Revolution, which beginning with the American Revolution, but then also the French Revolution and a series of subsequent revolutions that overthrew various monarchies and aristocratic dominance in Europe and the rest of the world, and then expanded capitalism. Okay, so capitalism was not new in the 18th and 19th century. There was a sort of nascent capitalism. What is capitalism? That just means middle class people are buying and selling things and accumulating cash and then investing in more things and getting richer and richer, which was happening in Florence already in the Renaissance, which fueled the Renaissance in Florence. But capitalism really took off in the 18th and 19th century, partly because of the Industrial Revolution. So what's that? The Industrial Revolution is basically the discovery of the steam engine and using coal and eventually oil, but first just water power, to power machines that could then turn out cloth in the beginning and then later other products much faster than an individual craftsman could make them. So, for example, in Europe for centuries, cloth was made by hand, by spinners spinning yarn at home and weavers weaving on a loom at home. While we're talking about that, I'm just going to show you my loom. So I'm a hand weaver, and my loom is not a power loom. Okay, so I'm just going to sort of hope you can see it. Let me turn on the light. Okay, so my loom, okay, now you can kind of see it. My loom is a hand loom, so it doesn't have a motor. When I throw the shuttle, I just throw it by hand. I raise and lower the harnesses by the use of these foot pedals that I'm showing you here. So the first thing to be industrialized in the Industrial Revolution was the making of cloth. And hand weavers like me were basically put out of business. They were mostly men, actually, until the Industrial Revolution, because men had longer arms and could make wider cloth for the most part. So that industry was industrialized, and a lot of women and kids went to work in textile mills, just kind of tending the machines, not actually weaving and spinning. The machines were doing that, but just sort of tending the machines, which at first were run by water power, but then eventually by steam engines and coal and electricity and so on. Okay, and then what's the nation state? Okay, so the nation state is the opposite of city states, you could say. Like Italy was just a bunch of city states until the 19th century when Italy was unified into a nation state. And the same thing happened in Germany. Basically, the same thing happened in America. The 13 colonies became a nation state, the United States of America, sometimes with a constitutional monarchy and sometimes without. Like we don't have a constitutional monarchy, we just have a constitution. We're a republic because we don't have a king. All right, so then I wrote down here the Enlightenment. So what is the Enlightenment? The Enlightenment is a philosophical movement, really, that began in the 18th century, that was, as I put it here, sorry. Thinking about the world and humanity based on science and empirical evidence rather than religions or myths, focused on rationality and a rationally organized society. That philosophical movement, which grew out of the scientific revolution, fueled the political revolutions first in the United States and then in France, and eventually dissolved the somewhat irrational feudal system that was just based on heredity. That is, if you had power, it's just because your daddy had power, not because you had any intrinsic ability of your own. And establishing nations states that were republics instead of monarchies was supposed to get rid of that. It didn't entirely, as we know. All right, so this is this I just put this painting in here not because it's an important part of art history necessarily, but because sorry about this. I don't know why I'm having so much trouble. Because it's about the founding of America. That is the writing of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are all Enlightenment ideas that Jefferson and Hamilton and others put into the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Okay, so this slide also, it's not important who made this painting or its place in art history. This is more just a slide to illustrate the Industrial Revolution, which in some ways was good in that it made people could own more than 2 shirts, you know. But it also created enormous ecological problems, and it created a lot of poverty. A lot of people from rural areas moved to industrial towns and started working under very dangerous and inhumane conditions in these textile mills, and they became even more impoverished than they'd been before and a lot less healthy. So these the fire here is from the coal and the blast furnaces that fired the making of iron ore and all of that was going on in the Industrial Revolution, that fired by steam and coal. Okay. All right, so before we start talking about the art movements that we're going to talk about today of the 18th and 19th century, we have to, the Enlightenment art, that is, the modern art, we have to sort of talk about what came before it, the immediate predecessor of these art movements. And the art, in other words, of the French aristocracy, Louis XIV, and those guys, Louis XVI. I guess there was a Louis XV in there somewhere, but he didn't last very long, I think. Anyway, what was their art? Well, their art was silly for the most part, in the view of most art historians. But actually, there's things to like about it. I mean, let's not be too close-minded about it. But their art was called Rococo. That's the name of this style. And this style has to do with everything kind of frilly and frou-frou. As we can see in this painting, there's this girl on a swing, and she's got a fancy silk dress on with many petticoats and layers and so on. And she's swinging on this swing, and there's a man in the background pushing her on this swing. That's her official boyfriend. Now, the fact that they have gray hair doesn't mean anything, because the French aristocrats wore these, they either put powder in their hair to make it look gray, or they wore gray wigs. Why? I can't explain that. I mean, this is real. I didn't put powder in my hair. But during the 1700s, both in the United States and in France, men, for some reason, wanted their hair to look gray. So you have a gray-haired man with a wig or powder or whatever back here pushing her on the swing, and another gray-haired man who's not necessarily old in the bush, hiding in the bushes here, and she's flinging her little silk slipper out at him, and he's looking up her dress. I mean, let's just be honest, what's happening? She's going, woohoo! And he gets a little glimpse of her. Well, we don't know if she's wearing underpants. She may or may not. Anyway, you know, it wasn't required in the, I think people wore little pantaloons or something under their frilly dresses, but we don't really know. She's got on some kind of thigh-length stockings. Anyway, this is just, and then there's a Cupid, statue of a Cupid here who's going like, don't tell anybody, there's another man in the bushes here. So this is all just silliness. It's about the sort of frivolous life of the aristocracy, the French aristocracy of the mid 1800s. And they ignored the famines and that were going on in France at the time that were just destroying ordinary people. They didn't care. They just taxed them more, to pay for their idle lifestyle of card playing and flirting with each other. And as a result, as you might imagine, there was a revolution. Okay, the French Revolution. But leading even before the revolution, and I should put a date on this, it's pre-revolution. The French Revolution started in, the French Revolution was in 1789, but it went on for a while, like 10 years or so, maybe more. And this is before this painting is from before the French Revolution, 1784. But there was already a reaction in France against this kind of silliness in art and in society generally because of the Enlightenment and the sort of growth of the idea of democracy or a republic. So David, the artist here, was basically one of the people who was advocating for a more democratic way of governing France. I don't know if he necessarily thought that the king had to be eliminated, but he was in favor of a revolution. And it's kind of hard to see how this painting exemplifies that, but I'm going to try to explain it. And there's a video in the content that does a good job of explaining it. All right, so first we're going to just start with the story here, the Oath of the Horatii. So who are the Horatii? Those are these brothers here, and this is their father, and they're making an oath, with this sort of Hitler salute, which looks a little ominous, but, Hitler hadn't come along yet, that they're going to go out and, do whatever it takes to defend their tribe, the Horatii, against another clan called the Alba, you could say, who are the enemies of the Horatii. But this is a problem. These are tribes that are living in different parts of Italy during the early Roman period, like before the empire. So this is like classical times. So it's classicizing art. It's making a reference to, Roman history. So then there you have these, or the early Roman Republic. So here you have these women over on the right side kind of looking all droopy and sad, like this. So what's going on? Well, one of them is, well, they're the sisters. Well, they're the sisters and wives of the Horatii. So one of them is an Alba. I don't know which one. And she has married one of the Horatii. But also, so she's worried that these guys are going to kill her brothers because her brothers are the Alba. And the other ones are the sisters of the Horatii. So, they're all sad because they think their brothers are going to die, or maybe their husband's going to die. Either way, it's going to be bad. But the men are all like, yeah, let's go get them. Why is that? And why is that an example of democracy? Because they're saying my country comes first. Like, too bad if you're sad, my allegiance to the tribe of the Horatii is way more important than your silly feelings. Now, this is dumb, obviously, but because people's feelings are never insignificant. And, I think we should all question the notion of going out to kill other people to promote our own clan. That's not, if you're going to do that, think carefully first. The Horatii are not really giving it a whole lot of thought. That's just what they're going to do. So why is this an example of good to David? Well, it's the opposite of the kind of patriotism, the lack of patriotism of the French aristocracy, which are just leading these silly lives of affluence and excess and idleness. Whereas the Horatii are, this is a very stripped down, this is not a palace in France with a lot of gold chairs in it or something like that. It's a very simple, rational space, right? And linear perspective is here. It's converging right about here somewhere. I think maybe here. The orthogonals are converging right there at near the swords and the head of this father here. But people, these are simple clothes. These people live sort of simple Spartan lives, you could say, and they have a kind of loyalty to a patriotic fervor that's willing to sacrifice everything. And actually, at the beginning of the French Revolution, the revolutionaries were taking enormous risks. The king could have just executed all of them, and that would have been the end of the revolution. He couldn't really because there were too many of them. But it was extremely risky, just like at the beginning of the American Revolution. Nobody knew how it would turn out, right? If you've watched the musical Hamilton on Disney Plus, you get that sense that at the beginning of the American Revolution, nobody knew that Americans were going to win, and nobody knew that in the beginning of the French Revolution that it was going to succeed. And its success was kind of ambivalent in the end. But anyway, David meant for this to be an example of a kind of patriotism that was good in contrast to the lack of real patriotism on the part of the French king or the French aristocrats who were just kind of wasting the country's resources on a big party for themselves. So that's the revolutionary part. But this style of painting in art history is called neoclassicism. So I wrote that word here. Why is it called that? Neo means new like brand new. Classicism refers to ancient Rome and Greece. And David was one of the main proponents of this style. So a lot of times the subject matter was about classical times, that is the Greek and Roman people and their history. It's set in a Roman architecture, right? The Roman arch and all that. But it's also characterized by this very clear linear drawing. So the drawing is more important than the color or the brushwork. You can't even see the brushwork. It's all smoothed out. There's no visible brushwork. And that's the neoclassical style. So we could spend a lot of time looking at other examples of neoclassicism, but I'm just going to show you one more painting, again by David, later in his career, after the French Revolution and after Napoleon took over in the chaos of the aftermath of the revolution. He made this very similar, in some ways, painting of Napoleon, where it looks almost like a photograph. The drawing is very clear. The contours of the lines that show the contours are very clear. There's no visible brushwork. It's very kind of rational. Okay, so that's the first art movement besides the Rococo that we're sort of studying of the early 19th century, neoclassicism. So in this part of the course, your goal is to kind of understand the series of art movements, beginning with neoclassicism. Okay, so now we're going on to the next ism, Romanticism. Now, obviously, I'm going kind of fast. There were a lot of more examples of neoclassicism that you can look up yourself if you're interested, and there's content about links to videos about that Oath of the Horatii painting in the content, which you should watch. Okay, but now we're going to the next movement, Romanticism. Okay, so first let's just talk about first I'll just tell you what's going on in this painting, and then I'll explain why it's considered a romantic painting. Now, romantic in this sense does not mean like a romance novel, that it's about romantic love or something. Romanticism as an art movement and it was bigger than just painting. It was music, it was literature, has to do with a sort of rebellion in a way against the rationality of the Enlightenment, the strict emphasis on reason and thinking and science and things that you can that the mind can explain. Romanticism is about the sort of things that are not so rational, like dreams, emotions, feelings, just the whole, I mean, that whole aspect of human experience is kind of in a dialectic, you could say, with rationality. So we have both reason and emotion, or as Jefferson liked to put it, the head and the heart. So, you know, everything that you do is not based on a strict calculus of, you know, how your decisions are not just based on science and logic. They're sometimes based on just intuition or a dream that you had, or just a feeling that you have, that, or an intuition. So that's what, so romantic art was sort of asserting, look, you know, humans are more than just their brains. They're also emotional creatures. Okay, but what's going on in this painting? In this this is sort of okay. The title of the painting is The 3rd of May, 1808, but Goya finished it in 1812. 4 years later, it was about an event that occurred in 1808, and this event has to do with Napoleon. All right, so what happened was, after the French Revolution and the terror in which a lot of people in France were executed by guillotine, there was a lot of chaos. And in this post-revolutionary chaos, a French general who was actually from Corsica, Napoleon, kind of staged a coup. He kind of took over France, and he decided to make France into an empire. That is, he wanted to conquer just about the whole rest of the world. And he kind of almost did. But in the end, he overreached and failed. But one of the things he tried to do was he invaded Spain. And on the pretext that he was going to get rid of the corrupt Spanish monarchy and replace it with a more rational, more democratic and rational civilian rule. But he was lying. He just put his brother on the front throne of France and sort of annexed on the throne of Spain, and sort of annexed Spain as part of the French Empire. So when the Spanish people figured out that this was just an invasion of their country by the French, they rebelled en masse on the 2nd of May and came out into the streets and fought the French troops hand to hand. Basically, just civilians did that without much success. A lot of them were killed. And on the 3rd of May, a lot of these French citizens were just rounded up and executed by, Spanish citizens, were in the city of Madrid, the capital of Spain. A lot of these Spanish civilians were just rounded up and executed or murdered, really, by French soldiers. Okay, so on this side of the painting, you see the French soldiers lined up as a firing squad, and one by one, these Spanish civilians, unarmed civilians, are put in front of the firing squad and just gunned down. And there's some right here that were gunned down a few minutes ago, and you can see the blood coming from their heads and bodies on this, in front of this kind of berm, earthen berm that they're using as a backstop. And so it's a horrifying picture of a war crime, really, and a human rights violation that Goya painted the painting to protest with. I mean, most paintings up till this time were painted on commission, kind of Like you can bet that Napoleon commissioned this portrait, right? I don't know about this one, but definitely this one. So a lot of these big paintings, what the French call grand machine, or big history paintings, were commissioned by somebody to sort of glorify the state or the monarch. This is a history painting on a really big scale. This is a big painting that does not glorify any state or any king or any ruler. It's about the state, France, that is, abusing its power against ordinary citizens. So this is pretty revolutionary for Goya to make a gigantic history painting in oil paint, but have it be about ordinary people being massacred by an army. So there's a video that we might have time. Well, basically, I think you should just go to the content and watch. There's 2 links in the content about the 19th century. One to an article about this painting that's really good. And then there's a video about the painting. Now, the video is important for a couple of reasons. One is it goes into all this story that I've just been telling you, and also it zooms in on some of the details of this painting so you can see what's called the facture. So the facture of a painting is how it's made. And this painting, in contrast to David's painting, has a lot of visible brushwork, which you can see as when you zoom in, especially the part about the face of this guy and his shirt and everything. It's clear that it's a painting. There was no photography yet in 1812, but it's not, the brushstrokes have not been all smoothed out to make it look quote unquote real as they have in this painting. You know that it's an oil painting. And it also looks like it's been made kind of quickly and under the influence of a lot of emotion. You can almost see the Goya going, you know, because he's outraged by this event. So there's no hiding of the painter's emotional engagement with this subject. And in that sense, there's the artist's own subjectivity, that is, the artist's own feelings and response to the subject matter, is okay. You know, you get the feeling with David that he almost didn't want you to think about who he was or what he thought. That's irrelevant, right? He's sort of the man behind the curtain, manipulating, pulling the strings to create the grand machine. Whereas Goya, he, as an artist, as a person, is sort of present in this painting, I think. And that's too is part of the whole romanticism thing. And plus the fact that it's about ordinary people, that's new in official art or art history, really. Ordinary people were not often the heroes of huge oil paintings, but beginning in the 19th century, they were, beginning with Goya, really, and then later Courbet and others. So you can see these people are deeply human. This man, you know, art historians have pointed out that he looks like Jesus, kind of. And these guys look like machines. They don't, you can't see their faces. They're just acting as a sort of tool of a repressive state. Whereas these people look fully human. They're emotional. They're, you know, confronting this terrible crime as sort of vulnerable humans. So that's one reason the video is important. It explains all that. But the second reason is it tells you how to analyze paintings generally, any painting or any artwork really, by first understanding the content of it, like what's going on in the painting, the context of it, that is what was going on around this painting when it was being made, and then finally the formal aspects. So the formal aspects are the things we talked about in chapter 3 and 4. That is the elements of art, the composition, and all of that. So watch that video because it'll help you analyze paintings. If you're still working on your essay, for example, your exhibition essay, it'll help you. And it'll just help you generally on the exam, I think. So watch that video. All right, so onward and upward with Romanticism. This is also considered a painting in the genre or movement of Romanticism in painting. And you can see again that the facture, that is important. The way the paint is put on the canvas, it's put on in visible, heavy, sort of impasto brushstrokes, which you could see even more clearly if you were looking at it in a museum, which is why we used to want people to go to galleries and museums, because seeing a painting in person is a lot different than seeing it in a slide or in a book. And so it's when it feels safe to do so, please go to the Frisk Center. It's open now, actually. And the gallery at Tech, wear your mask, stay 6 feet away from people, but go look at real art. Okay, so this actually is not from France. It's the movement of Romanticism in painting and music and literature was worldwide, really, or at least it happened in Europe and the Americas. And so in England, William Turner was taking it to the next level, really. So you can see that with Turner, there's not much drawing at all in the sense of contour drawing, the edges of things. He just sort of suggests things. Well, he tells you what this is about, the burning of the Houses of Lords and Commons. So Parliament caught on fire in the 19th century. It was a big deal, sort of like 9/11. I don't think it was a terrorist incident, but I'm not really sure. Anyway, so Turner was observing this from the other side of the Thames River, and there's this, you can sort of see the dome of a building here. It might be St. Paul's, I'm not sure, and a bridge crossing the Thames, and then various boats and things in the river here, and this horrible fire and its reflection in the water. And it is terrifying. This is a big painting, so it's meant to be scary, but it's also meant to be kind of awe-inspiring. And that's what we call the sublime. So the sublime is an important concept in landscape painting, and particularly in Romanticism. The idea that you could witness a phenomenon like a huge fire, a forest fire, for example, or a waterfall like Niagara Falls, and be awed by it and kind of terrified by it, but also kind of thinking that it's beautiful in a way. So that was Turner's thing. This is beautiful. The colors are beautiful. The colors are really important, a lot more important than, say, in neoclassical painting. In Romanticism, color takes precedent over drawing. And that's the old debate that goes back to the Renaissance, really. Is drawing more important, or is color more important? And I think, painters have been debating that for a long time. I don't think it's important to come down on one side or the other. They're both important. But in Romanticism, color was sort of emphasized over drawing, you could say, like in a painting like this, and the visible brushwork. So now we're going to look at another Turner painting. Okay, so this one, I think, is in the States. You can see it in a museum in Boston, I think. And again, when you first look at it, you're like, oh my God, look at that color in the sky. What is going on here? So eventually you notice there's a ship here and this stormy looking sky, and then an ocean with all these colors, different colors in it. And again, this is a big painting, a grand machine, although it's made in England, so just call it a big history painting. But then if you're in front of it in a museum, it won't take long for you to notice that somebody's leg is sticking up out of the water, and that there's a ball and chain on the leg, and that there's hands coming up out of the water. And then you notice the title, The Slave Ship, and you go, oh no, what is this? So this is based on something that actually happened in the 19th century, that, during the slave trade, um, the Middle Passage, where slave ships would leave Africa uh, for the Caribbean and the United States, and then pick up some rum in the Caribbean, take it back to Europe and sell it and buy more slaves, and just keep going back and forth like that. But if a storm came up, apparently the captains of these slave ships would sometimes throw the slaves overboard, because if the slaves died during the Middle Passage, they couldn't collect insurance for them. But if they fell overboard or something, or were thrown overboard, then they could collect insurance. I'm not sure exactly how it worked, but it was a very sort of horrible transaction, that, buying people, insuring them, and then, like any other kind of cargo, and then if they died, collecting the insurance. Like, hey, I spent $10,000 on those people and they died, so reimburse me. It's pretty unthinkable now, but it was normal in the 19th century. But for an abolitionist, a person trying to get rid of slavery, it was another outrage, another example of how inhumane slavery was, that it didn't consider these people to be people. So Turner is making a painting about this, really. And again, there's powerful feeling here. There's the subjectivity of the painter, Turner, making a painting about a horror, like Goya was, a horror, a human rights abuse, you could say, of the highest order. And at the same time, making the painting beautiful on the surface. So that's the sublime again, the sort of terror and beauty in the same painting is the sublime. The terror of the storm, the horror of throwing people overboard to be eaten by sharks, and yet there's this beautiful orange and yellow and red sky here, and this loose, visible brushwork with no real outline, no draw, a little bit of drawing over here, but not much. So again, there's a video in the content that you should definitely watch about this painting. Okay, so finally, we're going to talk about an American painting, also in this tradition of Romanticism, called the Oxbow. So the Oxbow is a real place in Massachusetts. It's near Amherst College, Smith College, Holyoke College, an area where there's a lot of something called the Five College Consortium, which is there. And those colleges were, I think they were just being founded in the 19th century when Thomas Cole, an American, painted this painting. So let's see what is romantic about this. Well, first, just the subject matter, the landscape, is inherently romantic. So the landscape had not really been an important topic of serious painting until the 19th century. Well, it had in China, as we saw in the earlier lecture. But in European painting, landscape on its own was not considered a legitimate topic of ambitious painting. You make a portrait of Napoleon, or maybe you'd make a history painting, but you wouldn't just go outside and paint something that you saw in the landscape. But in the 19th century, with Romanticism, that became a thing. It was a legitimate and important subject for painting. So that's one thing that makes it romantic. But also, Cole knows about this whole thing about the sublime, but he's divided his canvas into two halves, roughly. on a diagonal. So there's this half over here, which shows this wild, untamed wilderness area on a mountain. And then on this side, especially if you can get in close, and this is a fairly large painting, so when you see it in a museum, you can get up close and look at all the little things that are happening down here. And also, if when you watch the video in the content, it zooms in on what's going on down here. And this is the part of the Oxbow area where people, Europeans have cleared away most of the forest and created pastures, hay fields, farms, towns. So all of that is sort of emblematic of European conquest, you could say, of the American continent, which is summed up in a phrase that's important in American history: manifest destiny. So maybe you've heard that when you studied American history in high school. So what manifest destiny meant to the people who were proponents of manifest destiny was that Europeans somehow had a right to take over the entire continent from sea to shining sea, and that Native Americans should just kind of disappear or something. I mean, it's hard to kind of paraphrase the idea of manifest destiny because it doesn't really make sense. Like, why? why do Europeans have more of a right to the American continent than the people who were here for 10,000 years or something? Well, it doesn't really make sense unless you invoke God. And then if you say God gave us this continent to for our own purposes, and you, Cherokee and Chickasaw and Choctaw, too bad. I mean, that's basically what manifest destiny is. And again, it's hard to, when you say it like that, it doesn't seem to make much sense. And it probably didn't at the time, but a lot of people thought it was legit. Like a lot of crazy ideas, they seem like a good idea at the time. All right, so on this side, we have what's called the pastoral. That is the human-shaped, farmed, urbanized landscape. Well, not really urbanized, but small towns are here, and farms. But over here, you have this still wild mountain, and there's a tree that's been hit by lightning, and this storm that's kind of gathering here or passing away, maybe. So this is all Sturm und Drang, the sublime, the slightly scary but awe-inspiring nature. And then over here, the pastoral, the kind of quiet, peaceful, orderly world of little small farms. So that's really kind of the ideology that Cole is creating here. And actually, he's in the picture. He is right down here with a, well, you can see it better if you watch the video, but he's down here, and his easel and umbrella are up here. He's sort of looking back at you and as he's painting. And then he left his easel and his umbrella up here. And then, according to the video, I don't know if this is legit or not. If you look back here on this mountain, there's some Hebrew letters that are upside down that seem to say something about this idea that God has given this entire continent to to Europeans. Maybe. That's what the art historians say, that this is a little bit of cryptic iconography of Hebrew letters addressed to Yahweh. All right, so again, I really urge you to watch the video about the Oxbow, the video about the slave ship. This one doesn't have a video. The video about the 3rd of May, and the video about the Oath of the Horatii, because I'm just going to tell you, on the exam, you're going to have to explain what is neoclassicism, what is romanticism, and then we're going to go into some other art movements of the 19th century in the next lecture, and you need to be able to explain what they're about. And if you watch those videos and take notes, you'll be able to do it. And also take notes from this lecture. So you can't just rely on the text. You need to do a little extra research on your own, and that's the way college works. We don't spoon feed you everything. You got to go out and find some things on your own. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to stop the recording.